Hi, Grandma here, and I'm reading the second part of Chapter 17, To Kill a Mockingbird. The first part told a little bit about what the community was like that Ewell lived in, which he was the only house, but a Black community lived nearby. We also heard the testimony of the Sheriff Tate, mostly just describing how Mayella looked when he arrived and the explanation that she and her father had given him. Now it's time for her father, who was described as a bantam, cocky man. Think of a little rooster and how a rooster kind of struts, and that's the walk that he would have had. "Mr. Robert Ewell?" asked Mr. Gilmer. "That's my name, Captain," said the witness. Mr. Gilmer's back stiffened a little, and I felt sorry for him. Perhaps I'd better explain something now. I've heard that lawyers' children, on seeing their parents in courtroom in the heat of argument, get the wrong idea. They think opposing counsel to be the personal enemies of their parents. They suffer agonies and are surprised to see them often go out arm in arm with their tormentors during the first recess. This was not true of Jim and me. We acquired no trauma from watching our father win or lose. I'm sorry that I can't provide any drama in this respect. If I did, it would not be true. We would tell, however, when debate became more acrimonious than professional, but this was from watching lawyers other than our father. I never heard Atticus raise his voice in my life, except to a deaf witness. Mr. Gilmer was doing his job as Atticus was doing his. Besides, Mr. Ewell was Mr. Gilmer's witness, and he had no business being rude to him, of all people. "Are you the father of Mayella Ewell?" was the next question. "Well, if I ain't, I can't do nothing about it now. Her ma's dead," was the answer. Judge Taylor stirred. He turned slowly in his swivel chair, looked benignly on the witness. "Are you the father of Mayella Ewell?" he asked in a way that made the laughter below us stop suddenly. "Yes, sir," Mr. Ewell said meekly. Judge Taylor went on in tones of goodwill. "This the first time you ever been in court? I don't recall ever seeing you here." At the witness's affirmative nod, he continued, "Well, let's get something straight. There will be no more audibly obscene speculations on any subject from anybody in this courtroom as long as I'm sitting here. Do you understand?" Mr. Ewell nodded, but I don't think he did. Judge Taylor sighed and said, "All right, Mr. Gilmer." "Thank you, sir. Mr. Ewell, will you tell us in your own words what happened on the evening of November 21st, please?" Jim grinned, pushed his hair back. "Just in your own words" was Mr. Gilmer's trademark. We often wondered who else's words Mr. Gilmer was afraid the witness might employ. "Well, the night of November 21, I was coming in from the woods with a load of kindling, and just as I got to the fence, I hear Mayella screaming like a stuck hog inside the house." Here, Judge Taylor glanced sharply at the witness and must have decided his speculations devoid of evil intent, for he subsided sleepily. "What time was it, Mr. Ewell?" "Just 'fore sundown. Well, I was saying Mayella was screaming fit to beat Jesus." Another glance from the bench silenced Mr. Ewell. "Yes, she was screaming," said Mr. Gilmer. Mr. Ewell looked confusedly at the judge. "Well, Mayella was raising this holy racket, so I dropped my load and ran as fast as I could, but I run into the fence. But when I got disentangled, I run up to the window, and I seen—" Mr. Ewell's face grew scarlet. He stood up and pointed his finger at Tom Robinson. "I seen that black nigger yonder ruttin' on my Mayella." So serene was Judge Taylor's court that he had few occasions to use his gavel, but he hammered fully 5 minutes. Atticus was on his feet at the bench saying something to him. Mr. Heck Tate, first officer of the county, stood in the middle aisle, quelling the packed courtroom. Behind us, there was an angry, muffled groan from the colored people. Reverend Sykes leaned across Dill and me, pulling at Jim's elbow. "Mr. Jim," he said, "you better take Miss Jim Louise home. Mr. Jim, you hear me?" Jim turned his head. Scout, go home. Dill, you and Scout go home. You got to make me first, I said, remembering Atticus's blessed dictum. Jim scowled furiously at me and then said to Reverend Sykes, I think it's okay, Reverend. She doesn't understand. I was mortally offended. I most certainly do. I even understand anything you can. Ah, hush. She doesn't understand it, Reverend. She ain't 9 yet. Reverend Sykes' black eyes were anxious. Mr. Finch know you all are here? This ain't fit for Miss Jean Louise or you boys either. Jim shook his head. He can't see us this far away. It's all right, Reverend. I knew Jim would win because I knew nothing could make him leave now. Dill and I were safe for a while. Atticus could see us from where he was if he looked. As Judge Taylor banged his gavel, Mr. Ewell was sitting smugly in the witness chair, surveying his handiwork. With one phrase, he had turned happy picnickers into a sulky, tense, murmuring crowd being slowly hypnotized by gavel taps, lessening in intensity until the only sound in the courtroom was a dim pink, pink, pink. The judge might have been rapping the bench with a pencil. In possession of his court once more, Judge Taylor leaned back in his chair. He looked suddenly weary. His age was showing. And I thought about what Atticus had said. He and Mrs. Taylor didn't kiss much. He must have been nearly 70. There has been a request, Judge Taylor said, that this courtroom be cleared of spectators or at least of women and children, a request that will be denied for the time being. People generally see what they look for and hear what they listen for, and they have the right to subject their children to it. But I can assure you of one thing. You will receive what you see and hear in silence, or you will leave this courtroom. But you won't leave it until the whole boiling of you come before me on contempt charges. Mr. Ewell, you will keep your testimony within the confines of Christian English usage, if that is possible. Proceed, Mr. Gilmer. Mr. Ewell reminded me of a deaf mute. I was sure he'd heard the words Judge Taylor directed at him. His mouth struggled silently with them, but their import registered on his face. Smugness faded from it, replaced by dogged earnestness that fooled Judge Taylor not at all. As long as Mr. Ewell was on the stand, the judge kept his eyes on him as if daring him to make a false move. Mr. Gilmer and Atticus exchanged glances. Atticus was sitting down again. His fist rested on his cheek. We could not see his face. Mr. Gilmer looked rather desperate. A question from Judge Taylor made him relax. Mr. Ewell, did you see the defendant having sexual intercourse with your daughter? Yes, I did. The spectators were quiet, but the defendant said something. Atticus whispered to him, and Tom Robinson was silent. You say you were at the window, asked Mr. Gilmer. Yes, sir. How far is it from the ground? Oh, about 3 foot. Did you have a clear view of the room? Yes, sir. How did the room look? Well, it was all slung about like there was a fight. What did you do when you saw the defendant? Well, I run around the house to get in, but he run out the front door just ahead of me. I saw who he was all right. I was too distracted about Mayella to run after him. I run in the house, and she was lying on the floor squalling. Then what did you do? Why, I ran for Tate quick as I could. I knowed who it was all right, lived down yonder in that nigger nest, past the house every day. Judge, I've asked this county for 15 years to clean out that nest down yonder. They're dangerous to live around, besides devaluing my property. Thank you, Mr. Ewell, said Mr. Gilmer hurriedly. The witness made a hasty descent from the stand and ran smack into Atticus, who had risen to question him. Judge Taylor permitted the court to laugh. Just a minute, sir, said Atticus genially. Could I ask you a question or two? Mr. Ewell backed up into the witness chair, settled himself, and regarded Atticus with haughty suspicion, an expression common in Macomb County witnesses when confronted by opposing counsel. Mr. Ewell, Atticus began. "Folks were doing a lot of running that night. Let's see. You say you ran to the house, you ran to the window, you ran inside, you ran to Mayella, you ran for Mr. Tate. Did you during all this running run for the doctor?" "Wasn't no need to. I seen what happened." "But there's one thing I don't understand," said Atticus. "Weren't you concerned with Mayella's condition?" "Oh, I most positively was," said Mr. Ewell. "I seen who done it." "No, I meant her physical condition. Did you not think the nature of her injuries warranted immediate medical attention?" "What? Didn't you think she should have had a doctor immediately?" The witness said he never thought of it, but he had never called a doctor to any of his in his life, and if he had, it would have cost him $5. "That all?" he asked. "Not quite," said Atticus casually. "Mr. Ewell, you heard the sheriff's testimony, didn't you?" "How's that?" "You were in the courtroom when Heck Tate was on the stand, weren't you? You heard everything he said, didn't you?" "Yeah," he said. "Do you agree with the description of Mayella's injuries?" "How's that?" Atticus looked around at Mr. Gilmer and smiled. Mr. Ewell seemed determined not to give the defense the time of day. "Mr. Tate testified that her right eye was blackened and that she was beaten around the—" "Oh, yeah," the witness said. "I hold with everything Tate said." "You do?" asked Atticus mildly. "I just want to make sure." He went to the court reporter, said something, and the reporter entertained us for some minutes by reading Mr. Tate's testimony as if it were the stock market quotations. "Which eye her left? Oh, yes, that made it her right. It was her right eye, Mr. Finch. I remember now, she was bunged." He flipped the page. "Up on that side of the face, Sheriff, please repeat what you said. It was her right eye, I said." "Thank you, Bert," said Atticus. "You heard it again, Mr. Ewell. Do you have anything to add to it? Do you agree with the sheriff?" "I holds with Tate. Her eye was blackened and she was mighty beat up." The little man seemed to have forgotten his previous humiliation from the bench. It was becoming evident that he thought Atticus an easy match. He seemed to grow ruddy again. His chest swelled, and once more he was a red little rooster. I thought he'd burst his shirt at Atticus's next question. "Mr. Ewell, can you read and write?" Mr. Gilmer interrupted. "Objection," he said. "Can't see what witnesses' literacy has to do with the case. Irrelevant and immaterial." Judge Taylor was about to speak, but Atticus said, "Judge, if you'll allow the question plus another one, you'll soon see." "All right, let's see," said Judge Taylor, "but make sure we see." Atticus overruled. Mr. Gilmer seemed as curious as the rest of us to what bearing the state of Mr. Ewell's education had on the case. "I'll repeat the question," said Atticus. "Can you read and write?" "Oh, I most positively can." "Will you write your name and show us?" "I most positively will. How do you think I sign my relief checks?" Mr. Ewell was endearing himself to his fellow citizens. The whispers and chuckles below us probably had to do with what a card he was. I was becoming nervous. Atticus seemed to know what he was doing, but it seemed to me that he'd gone frog-sticking without a light. Never, never, never on cross-examination ask a witness a question you don't already know the answer to was a tenet I absorbed with my baby food. Do it, and you'll often get an answer you don't want, an answer that might wreck your case. Atticus was reaching into the inside pocket of his coat. He drew out an envelope, then reached into his vest pocket and unclipped his fountain pen. He moved leisurely and turned so that he was in full view of the jury. He unscrewed the fountain pen cap and placed it gently on his table. He shook the pen a little, then handed it with the envelope to the witness. "Would you write your name for us?" he asked. "Clearly now, so the jury can see you do it." Mr. Ewell wrote on the back of the envelope and looked up complacently to see Judge Taylor staring at him as if he were some fragrant gardenia in full bloom on the witness stand, to see Mr. Gilmer half sitting, half standing at his table. The jury was watching him. One man was leaning forward with his hands over the railing. "What's so interesting?" he asked. You're left-handed, Mr. Ewell?" said Judge Taylor. Mr. Ewell turned angrily to the judge and said he didn't see what his being left-handed had to do with it, that he was a Christ-fearing man and Atticus Finch was taking advantage of him. Tricking lawyers like Atticus Finch took advantage of him all the time with their tricking ways. He had told them what happened. He said it again and again, which he did. Nothing Atticus asked him after that shook his story. That he looked through the window, then ran the nigger off, then ran for the sheriff. Atticus finally dismissed him. Mr. Gilmer asked him one more question. About your writing with your left hand, are you ambidextrous, Mr. Ewell?" "I most certainly am not. I can only use one hand good as the other. One hand good as the other," he added, glaring at the defense table. Jim seemed to be having a quiet fit. He was pounding the balcony rail softly, and once he whispered, "We've got him." I didn't think so. Atticus was trying to show, it seemed to me, that Mr. Ewell could have beaten up Mayella. That much I could follow. If her right eye was black and she was beaten mostly on the right side of the face, it would tend to show that a left-handed person did it. Sherlock Holmes and Jim Finch would agree, but Tom Robinson could easily be left-handed too. Like Mr. Heck Tate, I imagine a person facing me went through a swift mental pantomime and concluded that he might have held her with his right hand and pounded her with his left. I looked down at him. His back was to us, but I could see his broad shoulders and bull-thick neck. He could easily have done it. I thought Jim was counting his chickens before they hatch. Well, that was certainly interesting. And I hope that it was interesting for you to hear the testimony of her father. So what do you think about that testimony? Do you think that really happened the way he said it did? Well, we'll find out. There's probably more coming in this trial. Okay, bye-bye.